I want to make a presentation to Peter Klein this morning. Say a little bit about the man who made the prize possible, Frank Turner Kurzweig. Dr. Kurzweig of Plaquemine, Louisiana, son of a very successful Louisiana entrepreneur, graduated from Harvard College and Harvard Medical School, trained in surgery at the Mayo Clinic and the Mayo Foundation, taught at Tulane Medical School, University of Miami Medical School, and Louisiana State Medical School at Shreveport. He was professor and founding chairman of the Department of Surgery. His wife, Harriet Britt Kurzweig, is a registered nurse and was supervising nurse at a hospital in New Orleans when they met. Because of their dedication to the free market and private property, they've established the Kurzweig Family Award for Liberty, Property, and Responsibility. The Kurzweig Award goes each year to a scholar or activist who has advanced the ideals in honor of which the prize is established: personal liberty, private property, and individual responsibility. And this year, of course, the prize goes to Dr. Peter Klein. You've got a bio of Peter. He's already been introduced. I'll just say he's extremely productive, author of more than 30 articles, edited 2 books. He teaches economics, as you know, at the University of Missouri at Columbia, senior fellow of the Mises Institute, and I'll embarrass him by telling just one story. I can still remember the day that we got an application letter from him for a fellowship when he was an undergraduate at the University of Tennessee, and I called up Murray Rothbard and I said, "Murray, I've never seen a letter from an undergraduate of this sort." I said, "May I fax it to you, and if you agree with me, will you give Peter a call and interview him on the phone?" And so Murray agreed, immediately called him, and it's been our great pleasure to be associated with Peter ever since. And so Peter, come on up here and let me present this award. Carries a $5,000 honorarium with it and a certificate, and Peter, you're well deserving.
And as a special note, he and his wife met at a Mises Institute conference.
One of the many side benefits of the Mises University that you may not have been aware of. Thank you very much, Lou, and I want to say thank you to Dr. and Mrs. Kurzweig for making this award possible. It's been a great privilege to be associated with the Mises Institute, first as a student and now as a faculty member since 1988. I look forward to many more years of professional association and friendship with all of you. Let me turn now to our subject for this morning, the economics of the firm. We've already studied the foundational topics in Austrian economics: praxeology, the theory of value and exchange, the theory of capital and interest. This morning I want to spend some time on another foundational issue, namely the Austrian theory of production and the firm, or what is sometimes somewhat misleadingly labeled in the mainstream literature the theory of the firm. Let me begin with a simple question: what is a firm anyway? If we went to downtown Auburn and picked a random person off the street and said, "Would you please draw a picture of a firm?" they would probably draw something like this. Maybe not quite so symmetric, but they would draw something that looks like a factory or a plant. And those of you who are economics majors or have had some economics courses know, well, that's completely silly. Of course, a firm doesn't look like that. We all know a firm looks just like this. or if you've been to graduate school, you know a firm looks like this. That's sort of the snapshot view of the neoclassical or mainstream theory of production and the firm. There are many problems with this account, and I won't spend a lot of detail on them, but just outline them for you in brief. The mainstream or neoclassical account of production and the firm, first of all, gives us very little insight into what a firm actually is. Why do we have firms? How large should the firm be? What products should the firm produce? How should the firm be organized or financed? Why are firms important in the economy? Does it matter whether we have private firms or, say, a government-owned production facilities? The emphasis in the standard neoclassical model, which those of you who have sat through an intermediate microtheory course will be very familiar with all the cost curves and the revenue curves, constrained optimization problems, and so on, it tends to emphasize or spend a great deal of time on the purely technological aspects of production, returns to a factor, the shape of the production function, and so on. Not that these issues are irrelevant for the entrepreneur, but they vastly oversimplify the problem that the entrepreneur faces. There's relatively, or rather less emphasis on the underlying economic aspects, the valuation rather than the technological aspects of production. There's no place, as I'm sure you know, in the conventional account of the firm for the entrepreneur. The entrepreneur is not mentioned in virtually any intermediate microeconomics text. By the way, the investor or the capitalist is rarely mentioned either. The way a typical production problem begins in an economics course is with a production function or a set of cost curves. A firm is here for some reason. Imagine that this firm exists. Let's find the profit maximizing price and quantity, something like that. How did this firm come to be here? Who provided the resources to start this firm in the first place? Where did the firm get its capital? Where did it get its financial resources with which to buy the assets that it owns, to rent the labor that it uses, and so on? Those questions are not asked. As Ayn Rand would say, blank out when you ask that question. Okay. There's very little insight, by the way, and this is increasingly recognized within the mainstream, into practical sort of managerial and policy issues, how firms should be structured, organized, financed, governed, etc. The production function approach to the firm doesn't give us much insight into those kinds of questions. Does it matter if the firm is regulated? Does it matter what kind of regulation we have? How do taxes and subsidies affect the firm? Again, there's some simple exercises that one can do, but this is not a great area of emphasis. And it's increasingly recognized that the conventional account of the firm doesn't give us a lot of insight into these kind of practical issues. Well, what I want to talk about today is two related aspects of what we often call the theory of the firm. So the term, the theory of the firm, is used today, perhaps somewhat confusingly, to refer to two different sets of problems or two different bodies of literature. One is what we might call the theory of production. How are goods and services produced in a market economy? How are inputs transformed into outputs, and so on? In this sense, the term firm is just a shorthand for a production process, a process that transforms inputs into outputs. Let's call that a firm in the neoclassical account of production function. Okay? I'm going to spend a little bit of time today giving you some Austrian insight into the production process, namely looking at the structure of production in a complex, multi-stage production process, an economy with a variety of partially specific capital goods. We'll talk about how factors of production are priced. We'll talk about the entrepreneur's perspective. What does it mean to speak of the entrepreneur's costs? What are the costs facing the firm? And how do they enter into the firm's decision problem? Or how do they enter into the decision to produce? And how much to produce, and so on. What more narrowly might be called the theory of the firm proper, or the theory of the organization of the firm, sometimes called the economics of organization, asks not so much about the production process, but about the firm itself as a legal entity. The theory of General Motors. Why does General Motors own the assets that it owns? What production processes will be within General Motors? When will firms tend to vertically integrate their activities? When will they outsource the production of their inputs? How will firms be organized internally? What kind of incentive schemes will they use? How will decision rights be delegated within the managerial hierarchy, and so on? Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about both production theory and the theory of the firm more specifically. Because we're limited in time, most of our discussion will be about production theory. I'll say a few remarks about the theory of the firm properly, and then have another talk later in the week, and I'm sorry, I don't remember the exact day, on, it's called The Free Market and Shareholder Rights, but it's really about the theory of the corporation, the market for corporate control, how financial markets work, the relationship between financial markets and the firm, and so on. So we'll get into more of these theory of the firm issues in that lecture, I think, on Thursday or Friday. Oh, let me just add that while the Austrian perspective offers unique insights into both of these aspects, the Austrian masters, Menger, boehm-bawerk, Mises, Hayek, Rothbard, and so on, they wrote quite a bit about the theory of production explicitly, but they didn't say very much about the theory of the firm per se. With one exception, there's some work that Rothbard did on vertical integration that I think is very important. But for the most part, we're charting new territory when we move to this latter topic. Okay. Briefly, what is the standard or mainstream or neoclassical account of production, and what's wrong with it? Well, if you think about what one does in these kinds of models, and I imagine that many of you have done them, the problem is basically to begin by taking as exogenous the things that we really care about. So in the model of so-called pure competition or perfect competition, right, assume that the firm is a price taker in the output market. Firm faces a perfectly elastic demand curve. The firm is also a price taker in the input market. Right, so we start by assuming that output prices and input prices are fixed or exogenous, and then we solve for the profit maximizing price and quantity. You know, maybe you do it with a graph, looking for intersections and tangencies. Maybe you do it using algebra. You know, if you're really fancy, maybe you do it using calculus. You know, and that's pretty much the end of the story. That's what, you know, 75% of a undergraduate intermediate micro theory course is on this aspect of, you know, finding where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And, you know, the truth is, it's really not that hard, okay? I mean, some of the problems look intimidating, but the logic behind it is pretty easy. I mean, some of my buddies in grad school and I used to joke about, you know, hiring ourselves out to, you know, IBM or General Motors as consultants and say, hey, you know, you want to know how to maximize your profits? We can do it for you. All we need is your production function. We need all your cost curves. We need your demand curve. Give us 5 minutes to do the math. We'll have your answer. Didn't get many calls for that, by the way. You know, you might object, well, that's not all we do in neoclassical production theory. Okay, it's true. There are, you know, extensions and elaborations, which you get sort of, you know, in the latter chapters of a typical textbook. Well, let's allow the firm to have a downward sloping demand curve. So we'll relax the assumption that output prices are exogenous. Say, well, the demand curve is exogenous, but the firm, the producer can choose a price-quantity combination. The analysis is pretty much the same other than that. Let the firm produce more than one product. Maybe have multiple firms, each of which is profit maximizing in the usual way, but they interact strategically somehow. Cournot and Bertrand models of duopoly, for example. Firms take rivals' actions into consideration. And there are other, of course, extensions and applications as well. But the main emphasis is on this simple constrained optimization problem of maximizing the level of profit. In standard theory, there's a huge emphasis placed on what Alfred Marshall called the representative firm. Okay, so not really all that interested in the complex interactions among many entrepreneurs and many factor owners in the economy. We spend an awful lot of time on one highly stylized, supposedly typical firm, and then we generalize from that to characterize an industry or even a whole economy. By the way, Rothbard has a comment in Man, Economy, and State that this belief in the modeling approach of taking sometimes output prices and almost always factor prices as given possibly stems from this error of emphasizing the representative firm. In other words, for the typical entrepreneur, the prices of factors of production may appear to be exogenous, but in fact what we're interested in is determining the prices of those factors in the through the actions of purposeful action of entrepreneurs. I'll come back to that point a little bit later. We also make the usual mathematical assumptions. All the curves are smooth and continuous and twice differentiable and all the rest of it. What's wrong with this? Well, for one thing, there's no passage of time in the model, right? Input and output decisions are made simultaneously. Production takes place instantaneously. So at the time that factors are purchased, output is immediately and simultaneously sold. So there's no sense that the entrepreneur might make a mistake. Right? At the time when the firm purchases its factors of production and decides what output level to produce, revenues for producing each level of output are already known for certain. Right? As opposed to a more realistic model in which factors of production have to be purchased in advance, up front, in anticipation of returns or receipts that may or may not come somewhere down the line. Okay, so whoever's making the production decisions here does not bear any uncertainty. Okay, there's no causal explanation for prices of factors, or for that matter, prices of outputs. Right? I mean, if you think about what really goes on in these models, you start by taking factor prices as given, then you construct the firms, use isoquant, isocost analysis to generate factor demand curves. Then you use these factor demand curves along with factor supply curves to try to come up with to say what are the prices of the factors. There's a circularity in logic. Begin by assuming exogenous prices, and then from that derive the supply and demand for factors, and use that to explain factor prices. It's not a causal analysis, what we might call a causal realistic analysis in the Mengerian tradition of analyzing the actions that people actually take. We could say there's an emphasis on the wrong problems, an undue emphasis on relatively trivial questions, such as, okay, take the first derivative and set it equal to 0 and find, where the profit curve is at a maximum. It's really not a very important question for the production process. It's a rather trivial technological issue. As I said before, it vastly oversimplifies and misleads us in trying to understand the decisions that entrepreneurs actually make in a market economy. Okay, what do I propose as an alternative? What did the Austrian economist propose as an alternative way of understanding production? There's quite a bit of production analysis in Menger, and some of it was discussed yesterday by Joe Salerno in his morning lecture. Boehm-bawerk, particularly in Capital and Interest, devotes a great deal of time to explaining the production process. You'll find relevant passages in Mises and Human Action, and in some of Hayek's books as well. Prices in Production, an easier book, and to some extent in his sort of last major economic work, The Pure Theory of Capital, which is probably Hayek's most difficult work. But the most detailed and elaborate explication of Austrian production theory is in Rothbard's Man, Economy, and State, chapters 5 through 9 in particular. Another book that has been almost totally forgotten by Austrians, even Austrians who claim to be sort of disciples of Ludwig Lachmann, is his 1952 book, Capital and Its Structure, which I think is by far Lachmann's best book. What are some of the issues that Austrians are interested in? Well, the key question is, how are factors of production, intermediate goods, organized, arranged, or deployed in a market economy? What determines the prices of capital goods? What determines the prices of factor services, land, labor, services of capital goods, and so on? And what determines how these factors will be deployed in the production process? Right, so there's a little bit of art. That's my Hayekian triangle. So there's the structure of production, a particular production process with the higher order goods on the left and the lower order goods on the right, and value increasing as production takes place through time. How many of you have seen those Hayekian triangles? Did Dr. Garrison show some of them to you yesterday? Okay. So, we want to know, well, how does this structure of production come about? I mean, what determines how capital goods will be arranged? Remember, this is a key issue for the Austrians. In most mainstream analysis of the market, the structure of capital is treated as sort of an almost irrelevant tangent. There's almost no capital theory in mainstream micro or macroeconomics. Just assume that the production process can be described with an aggregate production function or the production function of an individual firm, make it timeless, one stage, and you're done. The Austrians place a great deal of emphasis on the complexity of the structure of production in a modern economy. The vast number of stages, the number of intermediate goods, the difficulty of reallocating intermediate goods from one production process to another once the production process is underway. Right? That's the key to the Austrian theory of the business cycle. Without the complex structure of production, we don't have an interesting, there wouldn't be a business cycle problem in our sense. So we're very interested in that issue. And we also want to try to understand better the nature of entrepreneurship. Who is the entrepreneur? What is the reward to the entrepreneur? What is the source of profit in a market economy? And the flip side of that, loss. Okay, let's talk about each of these briefly. Start with factor pricing. Right, so by factors of production we just mean, capital goods or goods that are not consumed directly but are used to produce goods that are later consumed, okay? So, land is a factor of production, labor, services, and by the way, when Austrians use the term labor, they don't use it in the, Rooseveltian sense of, the heroic laborer versus the oppressive, manager or capitalist. Labor, we just mean toil or services that human beings perform. It could be physical, it could be lifting stuff, it could be thinking, right? So I'm performing labor services right now by giving you this lecture. Didn't put a lot of effort into it, but a little bit. Capital goods, right? Machines, equipment, they're used to produce consumer goods. And we might include in this list what Rothbard calls, for lack of a better term, ownership, or he calls it the decision-making factor. I'll come back to that point a little bit later, but this is the sense that the owners of productive factors have a sort of an ultimate or residual decision-making, or residual rights of control and decision that cannot be delegated. You always have the ultimate say in how your property is used in a market economy. That's slightly different from managing factors of production. You can delegate to an employee, the daily tasks of organizing a particular set of activities, but you retain as owner some ultimate decision rights. Rothbard thinks it makes sense to speak of this as a factor of production as well. Professor Salerno yesterday gave an introduction to the Austrian theory of imputation. Right, what is, or at least was, one of the best-known contributions of Menger, boehm-bawerk, Friedrich Wieser, and the early Austrians, first, second, third generation of Austrian economists. And that's this idea that the values of intermediate goods, of inputs, of factors of production, are derived from or are imputed from the value of the goods they produce. Okay, so if we think of a computer, personal computer, as an intermediate good into the production of, say, economics lectures, right? The value of the computer in this use is derived from the value that you guys receive from hearing the lecture, right? If you didn't value the lecture and this computer were used only for producing this lecture, then the computer would not have value or would have a very low value. So the idea is that value is not intrinsic in the intermediate good itself. It's imputed from the value of the things that people ultimately want to consume, right? And the theory, which I'll explain in detail in a couple of slides, holds that the prices of factors of production, and let me explain the terminology here. I'll just read it and explain. The rental factors of non-specific isolable factors used in variable proportions tend to equal their discounted marginal revenue products, or DMVP, as it's sometimes called. Discounted marginal revenue products or discounted marginal value products is the term that Rothbard uses. by the way, if you're taking notes, I know there's some students, not any of you guys, because you're all excellent students, but some of my regular students, they like to highlight or underline just sort of the key things I need to memorize for the exam. So, the key things you need to memorize for the exam. You didn't know there was going to be an exam. The prices of factors are equal to their discounted marginal revenue products or discounted marginal value products. That's the key point, that factor prices, with a few qualifications, tend to be equal to their marginal value products or marginal revenue products appropriately discounted. What do I mean? Why do I say rental prices? Well, because we're talking about the price per unit of time of renting the services of a capital good. So I'm not talking about the price of the computer. I'm talking about the price of the services of the computer. Right, just like labor as a factor of production. You don't own workers. You rent their labor services. You pay $10 an hour for somebody to lift heavy stuff for you. Okay, so we could say with land or with capital goods, we're talking about the price per period of time, per unit of time of using the services of these factors. Okay, and we'll come back in a moment to what about factors of production that you can actually buy outright rather than rent. Okay, but for the moment, just think about rental prices. Right? What's a non-specific? What are specific and non-specific factors? Specific factors are those that can be used only in one line of production. Intermediate goods that can only be used to produce one particular consumption good. And of course, there aren't many of those in the real world. By non-specific factors, we mean factors that can be used to produce multiple consumer goods, right? A computer is a fairly non-specific factor of production. It can't be used for everything, right? You can't use it to catch fish, okay, but you can use it for a lot of different things. Doing your computer work, I guess you use it as a door stopper. You could, use it as a weapon, I suppose. And if you've seen that commercial, I think it's for Snickers, where a group of guys are deer hunting, and deer pops up, and they all start throwing their Snickers bars at the deer, and the deer kind of looks confused and walks off. And I forget the tagline. It's, Snickers, it's not for everything, but it does satisfy your hunger, right? So Snickers bar is not completely non-specific. By the way, by a non-specific factor, we don't mean, of course, that it's perfectly substitutable, that it's exactly equally valuable in multiple lines of production, just that there's at least some substitutability. What do we mean by isolable? Isolable means the contribution that particular factor makes to the production process can be isolated or separated from the contribution of the other factors. Okay, so imagine that, and I'll show you a numerical example in a second, but the idea is if the output we're talking about is economics lectures, and the inputs are, books that I've read, and the computer that I'm using, and this podium, and so on. If I didn't have the computer, could I still produce economics lectures? Well, yeah, it would be harder. I wouldn't be able to use PowerPoint, and I'd have to write everything out in longhand or whatever, but I could, in principle, still do it. So we can think, what is the marginal contribution that the computer makes to the process? We could do the process without the computer, right? So we can ask ourselves, we can do a thought experiment and say, can we isolate the value that the computer contributes to the process? Right? This wouldn't be the case, say with a left shoe, right? Because a left shoe by itself does not really aid the process of walking without a right shoe. Okay, so it's difficult to isolate the value of the left shoe from the right shoe in contributing to me being able to walk down the street. That's what we'll call a case of fixed proportions. With fixed proportions, it's difficult or impossible to isolate the value of a particular factor. So that's another exception. If the factor is completely specific, or if the factor is not isolable, then its rental price does not tend to equal its discounted marginal revenue product. In those cases, all we can say as praxeologists is that the rental price will be determined through bargaining between the owner of the factor and the entrepreneur wishing to deploy the factor. Okay, so again, if you want, think of this last bullet as just sort of a caveat, and think about these words non-specific, isolable, and all that as caveats. The basic issue in most cases for the typical kind of factor used in the typical production process, the rental price of that factor will equal its discounted marginal revenue product or marginal value product. Right? Remember, let me just give you an example. Forget about discounting for a moment. What do we mean by marginal value product or marginal revenue product? I mean, here's a few examples. Suppose you have a production process with 3 inputs, A, B, and C. And so suppose that 4 units of A plus 10 units of B plus 2 units of C, by which we mean physical units, bales of hay or personal computers or whatever, can be used to produce $100 worth of output that can be sold on the market for $100. So the entrepreneur is, of course, estimating or anticipating what these returns will be. Suppose you took away a unit of A. Right? If you only had 3 units of A and 10 units of B and 2 units of C, so we've just taken away 1 unit of A, suppose we can produce only $80 worth of output. Right? Then we would say the marginal value product of factor A is $20. Okay, 1 unit of factor A at this level of production costs us $20 worth of output. Right? So if you're the entrepreneur, again, forgetting about discounting, if you're the entrepreneur and you believe that you can get $100 from having 4A, 10B, and 2C, and you currently only have 3A, 10B, and 2C, what's the most you would be willing to pay for another unit of factor A? Well, the most you'd be willing to pay would be up to $20. Right? I mean, you'd prefer to pay $1, let's say, but you'd be willing to pay anything up to $20. And if there's competition among entrepreneurs bidding for this factor service, then its price will tend to be bid up to where it's close to $20, the marginal marginal value product. But again, remember the caveat that in reality, that marginal value product, the most the entrepreneur would be willing to pay would be something less than the full marginal value product because of time preference. Okay, so because the entrepreneur has to buy factor A now, and he only gets the $100 at some point in the future once production has taken place. So there's if you assume there's an economy-wide rate of discount, there's some interest rate, going rate of interest, we would discount that $20 by the rate of interest. But again, just to simplify the algebraic example, let's just assume that there's no discounting. Quick clarification?
Yeah, on the last slide, you introduced marginal revenue product. Now you're introducing marginal value product.
Just synonymous. Two different terms. I'm sorry, I should not have used both terms in my slide. Today we typically use the term marginal revenue product. Rothbard used the term marginal value product, but they mean exactly the same thing. Yeah, sorry about that. Okay, so we could think of other examples. I'm going to make a note of that to change that. Right, so this first example is what we call variable proportions, meaning you can produce output with some A, some B, and some C, and there's some substitutability among A, B, and C. And we assume that the contribution of each factor is isolable. What about other exceptional cases like the second case? Here's one of fixed proportions, right? And in this case, the value of each factor is not isolable. So suppose, again, start at the same place as before. 4A, 10B, and 2C give you $100 worth of output. Right? Suppose that when you take away a unit of A, right, you've lost 25% of your A. You also have to reduce your usage of all your other factors by 25%. The extra 25% is of no value to you without the extra unit of A. Right? So now you only would use 7.5 units of B and 1.5 units of C. Hope I did my math right. Right. The idea is the extra 2.5 units of B are of no value to you without that extra unit of A. Just like the right shoe, an additional right shoe is of no value without an additional left shoe. Right. So suppose in this case that you did. Suppose you can only produce $75 worth of output using 3A, 7.5B, and 1.5C. Well, now the marginal value product or marginal revenue product of factor A is slightly higher than it was before $25. Right? In a case of fixed proportions, the marginal value product is typically higher than it is in a case of variable proportions. Okay, but the problem is, can we say that the $25 of output that we've lost is attributable specifically to factor A? Can we isolate the loss only to factor A? Well, no, because we're also using less of B and less of C. It's like we're decreasing our use of all of the inputs in proportion. So it's the loss of all of these inputs that contributes to our $25 loss of output. In a case like this, we can't say how much value is lost specifically due to A or B or C. So we cannot use the standard marginal value product or marginal revenue product explanation of factor prices to explain the price of factor A, B, or C in this case. Right? Another kind of a unusual, sort of a strange case would be like C. What if you have specific factors that are only useful in one particular production process, and they're indispensable, meaning you can't produce the output without this particular factor. You can't produce any output at all. So, suppose 1 unit of A and 2 units of B and 3 units of C produces $200 worth of output. But if you lose the A, you get nothing. Okay, so B and C by themselves don't produce anything without A. So, I think Salerno used the example of baking a cake. So if A is the flour or whatever, if you can't use the same amounts of eggs and sugar and butter that you were going to use and just not add any flour and get, a slightly smaller cake. You don't get any cake at all. You just get kind of a big mush. Right, so, well, what's the marginal value product of factor A in that case? What's the marginal value product or marginal revenue product of flour? Well, it's the whole cake. No flour, no cake. Right? No matter how many other factors you have. 1 unit of flour, cake. That's a pretty expensive cake. I don't know where I got that $200. We could try to think of examples like this, a part of an automobile. The carburetor in a car, say there's some part like the carburetor. If you don't have the carburetor, the whole car doesn't work, right? So the value of the car without the carburetor is zero, or is, just the scrap value of the car, a couple $100. With the carburetor, it's worth $20,000. So in that case, the marginal value product of the carburetor is, $19,900 or whatever, is practically the full value of the car. Now, some people have looked at that and said, well, wait a minute. But carburetors don't sell for $20,000 on the market. Right? But remember, the Austrian theory of imputation says that prices tend to equal their discounted marginal value products only when the factors are isolable, when they can be used in variable proportions, and so on. So the second and third cases here are just idiosyncratic exceptions to the rule. In these cases, the prices of the inputs would not tend to equal their discounted marginal value products, but instead would be set through one-on-one bargaining or one-on-several bargaining between the entrepreneur or entrepreneurs who wish to purchase the factors and the resource owners who own the factors. So if there was only one carburetor in the world and you had to have a car, to get to work, you'd pay $20,000 for the carburetor. But in fact, there are a lot of sellers of carburetors or carburetor services who are willing to give you the services of a carburetor for far less. Just clarification?
Yeah, well, let's go back to the first example. Are you missing normal profit of the entrepreneur? Because nobody's going to pay.
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
Are you missing the normal profit?
The normal profit
of the entrepreneur? Because no one's going to pay $20 for 1 more unit of A, assuming that the example holds for all the factors, because then you make no money. You paid exactly what you're getting, and why are you even doing the job?
Okay. Let me save that question till the end. Okay. Let's come back to that question. Okay. Okay. So, what is the theory of imputation, or how does this give us the theory of imputation? Well, remember again, Professor Salerno touched on this yesterday. The view associated, rightly or wrongly, with the classical economists, with Smith and Ricardo and so on, right, is the view that it's the cost of factors, some sort of objective intrinsic cost of factors, that ultimately determines the value of consumer goods. The labor theory of value, for example. That, the amount of labor that goes into the production of the good determines its consumption value on the market. Well, what the Austrians did, starting with Menger, is to flip this around on its head, right, and say, no, the causation is exactly the other way around. It's the value of the consumer good that is imputed back to the value of the factors, right? Salerno gave the example with, I think it was with the Amish and jewelry. If all of us adopted the Amish preferences for jewelry, the market price of diamonds would, fall dramatically, regardless of how much toil goes into digging diamonds out of the ground. Okay, he used the example of diving for pearls. Mises uses an example. Mises says an example with land pricing. In Human Action, Mises says, it isn't the case that champagne sells for a very high price because the land in the champagne-producing regions of France is very expensive. He says, no, it's the other way around. The land prices in the Champagne region are very high because people like to drink champagne. People are willing to pay a high price for the drink champagne. People have a very high willingness to pay, right? And therefore, the price of the land is bid up so that the price of the land is very high, right? So the causation goes from the consumption satisfaction that's involved in consuming the good back to or up through the value chain, up to the factors, and not the other way around. Okay? What does this imply about cost? Well, there is a sense in which costs are important, right? But costs, in the Austrian perspective, are always opportunity costs. The cost of using a resource is the consumption goods you don't get from using the resource in some alternative line of production. Right? The meaningful notion of cost to the Austrian economists is opportunity cost, and that applies to the cost of production as well. Okay, so there's another problem with the sort of the standard cost curve analysis and the notion of the representative firm, right? That if opportunity costs are subjective, right, the cost of using the computer to deliver this lecture is the subjective value foregone from using the computer in some other line of work, some other line of production. That cost is not observable. It's not directly quantifiable, right? And it's not uniform from producer to producer. Okay, so costs are always opportunity costs. So again, there's a germ of truth in this idea. If one interpreted the classicals to be saying, well, prices of consumer goods are determined by the opportunity costs of using the factors to produce those goods. That's a slightly misleading way of saying, you could say it better by saying, well, prices for particular consumer goods are related to the prices of the alternative consumer goods that we could have had. Okay, so if the alternative in using computers for giving economics lectures is using computers to play solitaire, not that I've ever done that, and if the value of playing solitaire is pretty low, then the opportunity cost of using the computer to deliver these lectures is pretty low, right? So if I'm the computer owner will be willing to lease it to me at a fairly low price because the opportunity cost of using it by me is pretty low. Okay, so what is called the marginal productivity theory of factor pricing and the factor allocation is this idea that factor prices tend to equal their discounted marginal value products or discounted marginal revenue products, and that through competition among entrepreneurs for deploying factors in various lines of productions, factors will tend to be allocated to their highest valued uses in production. Okay? Factor owners seeking to maximize their own returns will tend to deploy their factors in the lines of production where they can get the highest returns, which will be those lines of production in which the factors have the highest discounted marginal value products. Okay, and if we have a durable asset that can be purchased outright, like the computer, right? The price of the computer will tend to equal the sum of its future discounted marginal value products. Okay, so you just add up the expected stream of revenues from using the capital asset, and that's the most that one would be willing to pay to buy the asset outright. Okay, so this would apply to land, capital goods, and so on, presumably not labor, assuming that workers cannot be bought and sold outright. Okay. Now, Jim, this begins to address or is relevant to your question about profit, although it doesn't address it directly. We can take that up later. We notice we haven't said anything so far about profit. And in the neoclassical view, maximizing profit or allowing firms to earn a normal rate of profit and so on, it seems to figure pretty prominently. Why haven't we mentioned it yet? Well, I need to introduce or remind you about what Mises calls the evenly rotating economy, a concept also used by Rothbard. You can think of that as sort of a long-run equilibrium. Think of it as a long-run equilibrium. It's not exactly the same as the sort of mainstream or Marshallian long-run equilibrium. It's a condition in which people continue to do the same things over and over again. So assume that people's preference orderings are constant, are fixed. The availabilities of resources and so on are fixed. People continue to produce the same goods and services over and over again, continue to consume the same goods and services over and over again. There's no change in this world. There's no uncertainty about future consumer preferences or future resource availabilities, and so on. It's not, there's motion, there's movement in the ERE, but it's just a continual repetition of the same activities. Every day you get up and consume the same thing you consumed yesterday. The claim is not that such a state of affairs could ever exist in reality. It's purely a thinking exercise. Right? We say, well, what if we were in the evenly rotating economy? What would things be like? And we use that as a foil to say, what are things like in the real world when we're outside the evenly rotating economy, when we do have change, when we do have uncertainty? Right? Well, in the evenly rotating economy, as developed by Mises and Rothbard, factors of production continue to earn returns. They get their discounted marginal value products. So this includes, the factor of management, right? So what some neoclassical economists put in the category of profit or normal rate of profit is compensation to the manager or the owner for the opportunity cost of his or her labor. So that would be included that would be included in wages, technically speaking. So all factors are earning their marginal value products, discounted marginal value products, land, capital goods, labor, and so on. Capitalists, owners of capital goods, are earning interest. And the reason they earn interest is because there's still positive time preference in the evenly rotating economy. People prefer to consume sooner rather than later. So there's still interest in the evenly rotating economy. Capitalists who voluntarily give up the current consumption of their assets in exchange for returns in the future must be compensated for that. They're paid some rate of interest. But the key thing is, in this evenly rotating economy, this long-run equilibrium state, there are no profits, one might add, and no losses. There are no profits to be made. Why? Well, because profits are the excess of receipts over money costs, money receipts over money costs. And in the evenly rotating economy, where there's no uncertainty about the future, like competition among entrepreneurs for factor services, competition among factor owners for the sale or rental of their factor services, leads factor prices to be equal to their DMVPs. Right? So the entrepreneur pays out exactly as much as he takes in. Okay? There's nothing left over. There's no profit in the ERE. The reason there's no profit is because there's no uncertainty about the future. Right? The Austrian concept of profit is that profit is not a sort of a normal return to production or to being in business or even to managing, right? But rather profit is a reward for successfully bearing uncertainty. Profit is a reward for successfully bearing uncertainty. Loss is a penalty for unsuccessfully bearing uncertainty. Professor Salerno has a talk tomorrow or the next day on entrepreneurship, profit, and loss. He'll go into this in more detail. Right, so the idea is, going back to the example, we had the numerical examples, 4A and 3B and 2C or whatever produce $100 worth of output. Well, now let's assume that nobody knows for sure how much that output will be worth. Maybe it'll be worth $100. Maybe it'll be worth $120. Maybe it'll be worth $90. Right? So if an entrepreneur who successfully anticipates that the price will be, say, $120, but can purchase the factors now for $100, forgetting about discounting, is going to earn an extra $20. Right? The entrepreneur who overestimates the value of the final good. Say the entrepreneur thinks that the final good will sell for $120, but it'll really only sell for $90, and he shells out $100 today worth of factors, and then it turns out down the road he can only sell the output for $90. Well, he's earned a loss of $10. Right? So profit is the difference between the future uncertain receipts from the sale of the output that's produced, and the for certain paying it now upfront expenditures on the factors. Right? So because different entrepreneurs have different estimates or forecasts of future consumer demands, different guesses as to what prices will be, the ones who are good will be able to get factors for less than they can sell their final output. They'll earn a profit. Those who cannot will earn losses. That's the essence of entrepreneurship in the Austrian sense. Entrepreneurship is this act of bearing uncertainty, of making decisions now in anticipation of uncertain future rewards. Okay? So in the theory of production, we're talking primarily about the capitalist entrepreneur, what Rothbard calls the capitalist entrepreneur. Mises calls the entrepreneur promoter. So here we mean, a business person, businessman or businesswoman who, uses saved capital, money to purchase factors to produce goods and services and then sells them on the market. There is an element of entrepreneurship, as in meaning uncertainty bearing, in all human decision making. Right? You got out of bed this morning and dragged yourself to, the Mises Institute in anticipation of getting something out of these lectures. So you took a little bit of a gamble, not with me, but with some of the other guys. So you can say, well, you acted entrepreneurially, and that's true. That's in a technical sense. Laborers, you might say that some element of the return to a laborer is profit, in the sense that laborers take gambles, investing in training or education in anticipation of getting a higher paying job. That's bearing some uncertainty. Moving from one town to another, hoping to get a better job in the other town. That's bearing some uncertainty as well. Right? But in production theory, we're primarily interested in the capitalist entrepreneur. Okay? That's what entrepreneurship is. So outside the evenly rotating economy, entrepreneurs do earn profits and losses. Right? There's an additional stream of income outside the ERE that doesn't exist in the ERE. In the ERE, all you have is factor incomes and interest. Outside the ERE, you also have profit and loss, because there's uncertainty about future prices. So really the most important use of the ERE, this concept of the ERE, is to distinguish profit from interest. Because in the mainstream literature, those two terms are often used somewhat confusingly or imprecisely, and possibly even interchangeably. Right? Notice that in the Austrian conception, there's no such thing as a rate of profit. It doesn't make sense to talk about a rate of profit. What normal profits, excess profits, as you get in sort of intermediate micro theory. Right? Because profit isn't a rate. Some firms earn a level of profit based on successful anticipation of future prices. Some entrepreneurs earn losses. There is no general rate of profit that's earned by all entrepreneurs. You either make a profit or a loss, or you break even. Okay? Okay. Now let's move on. Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Clarification? Yes.
When you say ownership and entrepreneur, that's the same thing?
That's actually a hard question to answer. Yes, think of ownership here as the mental act of deciding ultimately how resources will be used. So the party that owns capital assets, owns land, and so on, has to exercise some judgment in how those resources will be allocated in production, and you get some kind of return for exercising that factor. It's not strictly the same as entrepreneurial profit and loss. Although the entrepreneur, the capitalist entrepreneur, in his or her capacity as a resource owner, will earn this rent or return to ownership. Okay, it's a minor point though, so we can come back to this in the Q&A. Yeah. Okay. If you have, just a clarification, but.
I was just going to ask how you distinguish that from management.
Right. I think that I can, but again, I don't want to spend time on it now. We can discuss this later at the end. If that bothers you, just delete it, and it won't affect 99.9% of the presentation. So, okay. What about the firm itself? We've talked about the process of production, how inputs are transformed into outputs, but we haven't yet said a whole lot about the firm itself as a legal entity. What do we mean to talk about a firm as opposed to a production process? In the traditional orthodox neoclassical micro-theory, there is no distinction between a firm and a production process. Right? The firm simply is a production function, like the picture we saw at the very beginning of the lecture. Right? What is called the theory of the firm in intermediate micro textbooks is just the theory of production. There's a lot of problems with this. It doesn't tell us much about how many production processes a particular firm will own. Can multiple firms jointly operate a single production process, and so on. So what we can say is the neoclassical theory, if it's good for anything, it's merely a theory of the production process. It's not a theory of the firm. And as we've seen, it's not really a very good theory of the production process anyway. There's some other conceptions of the firm that you might have encountered in your readings or in your in classes that you've taken. Just mention them. It's called the nexus of contracts view that's popular among some legal scholars and some financial economists. I mean, which essentially holds that there is no such thing as a firm. Firm's just purely sort of a legal fiction, has no economic significance. Whether resources are owned by one firm or shared by multiple firms, it doesn't really matter. In management departments, there's a very popular account, sometimes called the knowledge-based or the capabilities view of the firm, which is popular among some Austrian economists, by the way, because of the concept of knowledge in a sort of Hayekian sense. But what I will offer to you and defend, what I will try to defend as the correct, what I think is the correct account of the firm, we might call it the property rights view of the firm. Meaning the firm, what is the firm? The firm is conceived in terms of the ownership of assets. Ownership of assets. Right? The firm is the entrepreneur, the capitalist entrepreneur, the owner. Or could be a group of capitalist entrepreneurs who pool resources together like a corporation, a joint stock company. Plus the alienable assets that he owns. The capitalist entrepreneur plus the alienable assets that he owns. Right? Alienable just means assets that he can buy and sell. Assets that he can alienate from his person. So his so-called human capital, a self-employed individual who doesn't own any capital equipment, doesn't have any tools or cash balances, but just has his own brain, would not be considered a firm, right? But an entrepreneur who owns machines and equipment and has cash and so on would be a firm, even if it's just one person. Okay, so essentially we're thinking of the firm in terms of property, in terms of ownership. Right? So if you think, what is General Motors? Well, General Motors is the tangible and intangible property that is owned by the shareholders of General Motors. Okay? That includes the plants and the equipment and inventories and investments, cash, the contractual right to have certain labor services provided for when employees have signed employment contracts, perhaps the contractual right to have some inputs delivered, minus any contractual obligations that the firm has made to sell, to give stuff away or whatever. Okay, so we're thinking about the firm in terms of property. Who owns the stuff? Okay, and the distinction between Ford and General Motors is that Ford owns this set of property and General Motors owns this set of property. Okay, note by the way that this is not the same thing as a production process, or in neoclassical terms, a production function. One firm can own many production processes, and several firms could jointly own one production process. Okay, Rothbard uses typically felicitous phrase. He says the typical firm is a melange of assets at different stages of production. So the typical firm has a lot of stuff going on. May have multiple production processes in different stages of production, has some inventory on hand, and so on. Okay? So let me just briefly outline in 2 slides the theory of the firm, and then we'll be done. Okay? The kinds of questions that are asked in the modern theory of the firm would be questions like, well, why do we have firms in the first place? Why do we have an owner or a ownership team owning a whole bunch of assets like General Motors, as opposed to, say, a world where every person is an independent contractor who contracts separately with every other independent contractor to produce stuff? Right? Why do we organize activities jointly under this rubric of the firm with owners who hire managers who tell people what to do? And the basic answer offered by Coase in his famous, Ronald Coase in his famous 1937 paper, The Nature of the Firm, is, I think, the right answer. That firms exist because there are what Coase called transaction costs of exchanging on the market. Right? There are costs of searching for trading partners and negotiating contracts and enforcing contracts and so on. There are transaction costs, haggling costs, and so on to conducting market exchange. Sometimes it makes sense to internalize transactions or activities within a firm and allow the entrepreneur to make allocation decisions by executive fiat. Okay? So there is authority within a set of assets that are owned. Inside the firm is not a market, although it may have some market-like features. Inside the firm, resources are allocated according to the owner's authority, okay, as opposed to in a decentralized fashion in the market. What determines the boundary of the firm? When do firms get big? Why are some firms large, some firms small? What activities or transactions are inside the firm, which are outside the firm? Well, Coase's transaction cost account, as elaborated by, in subsequent decades, the last 20, 30 years, by Oliver Williamson and others, explains the trade-off between the transaction costs we've just mentioned and what we might call internal transaction costs as well, the cost of monitoring groups of people. So the boundary of the firm is determined by this trade-off between avoiding these external transaction costs and trying to avoid incurring internal managerial or bureaucratic problems. Rothbard also refers to indivisibilities in certain factors. What he calls the decision-making factor or the ownership factor cannot be spread over an infinite set of activities. That limits the size of the firm. Probably the most original Austrian contribution in this area, I think, is Rothbard's analysis of economic calculation and how the need for economic calculation places a limit on the vertical boundaries of the firm. And if you're interested in that, I have an article in the Review of Austrian Economics in 1996 that basically just elaborates Rothbard's contribution to the theory of vertical integration in terms of the socialist calculation debate. Okay. And a third set of questions within the theory of the firm: how should the firm be organized internally? So we're interested in things like how decision rights will be allocated, who gets to decide what. Right? No firm is organized as a pure hierarchy where the owner makes all decisions on a day-to-day basis. Right? The owner will delegate some decisions to subordinates. Which ones should be delegated under what circumstances? Well, there's a theory of delegation that can help us out here. There's some connections here between Mises' work on socialist economic calculation, but we can discuss that in the Q&A if you want. How should employees be compensated? What kind of incentives should be provided? How should performance be evaluated within a firm? Austrian Economics has a lot of insight into these questions. But Mark is giving me the time signal, so I'll come to my concluding slide. And I do, some of my teaching is at the MBA level, and with MBAs you have to end every presentation with takeaways. Okay, so if you only remember a few things, If you only remember one slide's worth, here it is. The basic point is that Austrian economics does offer a unique account of production. It's not just a verbal rendition of sort of the standard production theory. It's a causal, realistic analysis of how factors are priced and used. It's grounded in marginal utility theory, kind of the core Austrian theoretical contribution. Emphasizes the economic, not the technological aspects of production. What I mean is there's a sense, I think both within and outside some Austrian economics, that Austrian economics really doesn't offer much unique here. It's interesting. I mean, I mentioned earlier that a lot of my material comes from Man, Economy, and State. Rothbard devotes 5 full chapters to production theory. It's the largest single section in the book. Yet there hasn't been a lot of attention devoted to this area within the Austrian school. I think there's a perception, again, by some Austrians, and certainly outside the Austrian school, that, well, Austrian economics is really about knowledge and spontaneous order and, kaleidic uncertainty and sort of all these avant-garde kind of issues with fairly little attention placed on what we might call the more mundane aspects of economic analysis, things like the production process. But I think the Austrians do offer a unique perspective here. There's a lot more that needs to be done in this area. I've just mentioned a few. Up here. Rent theory needs further development. This internal organization stuff is all pretty new. Relating production theory more specifically to the process of the business cycle. Doing a more extensive critique of the standard neoclassical cost curve analysis and many other areas as well. So I hope that some of you will go on we'll study this area, and maybe we'll make the next set of pioneering contributions in Austrian production theory. Thank you.